Welcome, friends, to this Talkback conversation about Raegan Truax's Recitation, a 13-hour performance that many of us saw spanning yesterday through till 1 in the morning. My name is Ken Colton Fromm. I'm the Hereford Director of the Arts and Humanities. And welcome. For the next hour, we'll have a chance to offer our own reflections on Raegan's performance. I want to introduce 4 panelists that will begin this discussion, and then we'll be able to hear from the rest of you about your own reactions to Raegan's performance. First, I want to introduce Marilyn Arsem, who's been creating and performing live events for more than 40 years and has presented her work in 30 countries around the world. She's currently based in Boston, Massachusetts, where she also teaches performance art workshops internationally. Arsem was the 2015 recipient of the Maud Morgan Prize at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where she presented 100 Ways to Consider Time, which was 100 different 6-hour performances on the nature of time over 100 consecutive days from November 2015 to February 2016. Also want to introduce Angela Hennessy, who is an Oakland-based artist and co-founder of See Black Women. She is an associate professor at California College of the Arts, where she teaches courses on visual and cultural narratives of death and textile theory. Her work has been featured in Sculpture Magazine, The New Yorker, Nat Brute, Surface Design Journal, Textile, the Journal of Cloth and Culture, and recently in exhibitions at the Museum of the African Diaspora, Point Two Gallery, and Southern Exposure. She has upcoming exhibitions at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles and the Oakland Museum of California. And she is also a San Francisco Ortega Award winner and has participated in Facebook AIR program and the Mesa Refuge Writers Residency. Also want to introduce Derek Phillips, who is a composer and sound artist based in San Francisco, my hometown as well. His work has been performed at the Asian Art Museum, the Young Museum, Exit Theater, the Garage, Kunststoff Arts, the Performance Arts Institute in San Francisco, Jack Arts in New York, ZKU in Berlin, Sidney Yates Gallery in the Chicago Cultural Center, as well as Stanford University. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Raegan Truax, who is an artist scholar whose research manifests in live performance, practice-based experiments, and writing. She is currently a Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the John B. Hereford Center for the Arts and Humanities and visiting assistant professor of visual studies at Haverford College. She holds a PhD in performance studies from Stanford University, an MA in performance studies from NYU, and an MA in gender politics. She's currently working on her manuscript, Durational Performance, Temporalities of the Untimely Body, which focuses on global women artists who bend, suspend, queer, and reclaim time as a political material. Now, in 2019, Truax began working on a series of 12-plus-hour performance conceptualized around public mourning and collective grief. The first performance in this series, All the Nothing, took place at Artist Television Access in San Francisco in 2019. Recitation continues this work and investigation. So it's my pleasure to turn this over now to Angela, who'll begin the conversation and talk back. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Raegan, for the invitation. Thanks everyone for being here. I wanted to start first with a welcome back to Raegan specifically. I often wonder, and I want to assert that performance as a field, as a discipline, finds its origins in rites of passage, right? That there is a need to acknowledge a change, something has occurred, something has happened, right? And so durational performance is as much marked by the passage of time as it is by test, by endurance, often, leading to kind of altered states of consciousness, and this relationship between physical and spiritual or emotional labor. And so I've been thinking about how your physical body, what you are doing in the performance, is mirroring some kind of spiritual or emotional kind of psychological landscape. But to frame it really as a rite of passage, which involves a departure, right? Usually one leaves the family or leaves community. There is a test which yields some kind of epiphany or new insight, right? And then there's the return. And so this kind of, I think the return and the welcoming one back from a journey is incredibly significant and critical in terms of, how we create community and how we create family and what that means for us to be witnesses, and participants in some way in terms of your experience and the journey that you have been on. So I want to, just extend, and if everyone could extend maybe a welcoming or some kind of gesture of return to Raegan to get us started. So I think what we can do, there are lots of interesting places to start in terms of even just the opening of the space and seeing, what the installation, the objects in the installation. There are, I think, for me, immediately some questions come up around how do we read? How do we read passage? How do we read time? How do we read gestures of grief? I have a question, just in general to people on the Zoom here. If you didn't know Raegan's work, or you didn't know, you hadn't read maybe the invitation or the description of Recitation, like what would these gestures and what would the body language look like? How would we read that in the color palette? In the objects in the room. I think there's a lot that is happening in terms of the elements in the space as well, thinking about soil and dirt and the marking that is happening from the labor, right, that you are engaged in. So I want to give Marilyn also a chance to start us off, and then we can come back into some specific questions and approach the whole conversation in a very an active way. So if folks have questions that they want to raise a hand or signal us some way in the chat, and we can open it up for you to respond as well.
Thank you, Angela. I want to follow up on your reference to the elements in the space. But first, I just wanted to thank everyone who was involved in making this happen. It's not easy to do live work during the pandemic, and making durational work adds additional complications. So thank you to all the behind the scenes people at Haverford College for making this possible. And I want to especially thank Raegan for persevering and continuing to make live work during this period. She's a better person than me for that. And finding a way to work with the constraints of this pandemic. And thank you also to Derek Phillips for the creation of that multi-layered sound score that you made for the work. So continuing, just some notes that I took while watching. And I'm just going to read what I wrote. 1 foot in the grave, past lives hovering, lying on the earth, slowly being buried. I was interested in the minimal amount of materials that were in the space, actually, and the sparseness of the sound. And I appreciated the kind of space that left us for imagining and remembering, for contemplation. Watching those bags hovering and swinging in the air, I don't know what was making them move. I couldn't feel the air myself, being in my own home watching it remotely. But I did, looking at those bags, imagine the remnants of the people's lives that were inside them. Each bag had a personality and clearly a history. And I imagine many different people had used them over the years. The voices took us into fragments of other people's lives. And I appreciated, because I was there watching the entire 13 hours and 45 minutes, I appreciated the repetition of the voices coming back again, because each time I heard something else that they said, I didn't take it in all at once, and I knew that I didn't have to, that it would come back again and I would hear it differently, seeing it, hearing it through what I was seeing the scene differently from what I was hearing as well. And I especially appreciated all the other sound that was part of that score. Sounds from different environments and different places. Some, felt industrial. There was music, there was water, there was natural sounds. And so every time the sound came back, it also framed what I was seeing differently. And I appreciated the silence because it let me hear the sound again. I wasn't inundated. I was alone with my own thoughts, and then it came back in a new way. So I wonder, I know the answers maybe will come later in this conversation, but I wonder about how the people who witnessed the work live experienced it and what they thought about while watching it. And it also made me think again about the differences between an audience who witnesses a durational work over the entire time, or even over an extended period of time, versus the people that see it in small sections and come in and out, or maybe only come once. In my own work, I've had the experience of both kinds of audiences, and they respond to the work differently based on their own time with it. I was at home alone, and except for a few moments when the audience entered the screen, I thought I was alone with the work. I did ask Raegan today how many people were there in the room, and I understood that it had people all the time, but that's not what I was seeing. It was really remote for me. There was a level of detail that I couldn't see. I wasn't able to smell it. I couldn't feel the temperature in the room. And there were small sounds that I know that I couldn't hear, the sounds of Raegan's movement, the sounds of the materials in her hands, to feel her muscle tension the way you do when you're an audience. You pick up the energy of the performer. And there was a distance that I had on that that was sad. I will say that. But I confess I'm thinking about it a little differently, having learned that something like 50 or more people actually were there. I can retroactively feel like I was with other people, which I didn't feel at the time. So some of my questions, I wonder what Raegan learned in making the work. I wonder if it was enough time for her, because I know originally she thought of it as being 26 hours. So I'm curious about what might have been different in that version. But I'm going to stop there. And I don't know how we want to continue.
So, I would love to talk a little bit about the relationship between people who come into the gallery space with Raegan, and then, everyone who was watching at home, right, which is then mediated by a screen, right? And some of those things that you were, hinting towards, Marilyn, in terms of, that experience of feeling like you were alone with the work, right? And then to realize, oh, there were all these other people kind of in and out. And there was, I think it was the first person who I saw enter into the gallery space fairly early on in the performance. And I was kind of taken aback by it, like, what's happening? And I was thinking about, like almost,
standing in the soil.
Yeah, and I was just kind of wondering, like, oh, was this planned? Is this part of it? Is this, like I wasn't really sure. And what I was noticing was that I felt a sense of protection towards Raegan, like you were standing, at the opening, kind of I think, Marilyn, you captured it really well, one foot in the grave. You have this kind of, it's sort of like a classical Grecian, like contrapposto stance, right, where your body is sort of tilted, and so I was thinking about your body language and gestures, and this person who, kind of came in, like it felt really quick to me, the way that this person came in and was right there, close to you in the dirt, and I was just kind of thinking, like, what, it felt almost a little bit like a confrontation or a challenge. And, so I felt like very, kind of captivated. And even in moments where there was, almost nothing happening, like very little movement, or, it seemed also that in that emptiness, there was so much happening. And so even the empty, kind of still moments felt very full and very rich. And it actually kind of reminded me of, one of these questions that come up, like, at least this happens with my therapist, right? Like you fill out this form, your check-in before your therapy session, and they ask you about if you've been experiencing anxiety or moving too fast, or one of the questions is moving too slow that no one else could perceive that you were moving, So I was thinking a little bit about that, of, kind of wondering also, I was really wondering, like, where you were, Raegan, in your thought process. Like I was seeing where you were physically, and I was thinking, like what, what really, where is she? And as we move on, I hope to get to that a little bit more in terms of your own experience. But the interaction, it felt like the performance as a whole felt incredibly rich and full, and that even though there was, kind of, the gestures were very, I don't, they're repetitive. And sometimes I would leave the room where I had the screen on, and I would come back in and I'd be like, wait, how did she get over there? Because I would have missed like a minute, and it seemed like some, like all of this time had passed, or something had happened in, just a minute of not looking or not watching. So I'm very curious about that as well. What about questions? Oops, questions from other folks to get us into the conversation? Do we have?
Hannah has her hand up.
The host asked me to unmute, so hopefully I'm following the rules. Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Raegan, and welcome back. And I was curious about something Marilyn said earlier that I wanted to ask Raegan about. I was curious about the transition from 26 hours to 13 hours, because 13 hours seemed right to me, like, because my mind went to thinking about how 13 in the tarot is the number of the death card. And I was just curious about how you think about numbers and time as a durational artist in this context, or more generally.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for that question. I'll just first, since I'm just speaking for the first time, say a heartfelt thanks to everyone who came to the performance, to Marilyn and Angela for their comments. They've already given me a lot to think about. And of course, to James and Matt and everyone at Hereford, Charles and Alex and Zach, who helped get that amazing sound come to you live. And James and Matt, who have been champions of trying to help me get what I need, like dirt in the gallery. So I really appreciate that. And then also thank you to everyone who wrote a letter. Several of you are also in this room, and some of you may have heard your voice last night quite profoundly. So that's another layer that's here. So I'll just say quickly on the time. Sometimes sometimes I think about numbers in like just a rigid or like a what's going to help me make the piece way, but it's always based on the concept of the piece and then some formula that can help me start. But one sort of durational rule is you need to like create the frame to start. And then once you start, you have to be willing to change that frame before you actually like start the performance. So 26 hours was based on, I guess, in thinking about grief and death and also our current news cycle, there's something about this 24-hour daily death toll that I wanted to spill over. I was thinking 26 hours conceptually because I was thinking about grief doesn't end in a 24-hour cycle. And so how could I spill over 24 hours in every time zone? Because I was also thinking about how this would be live streamed. And that was another layer. It's the first performance I've done where there's an audience I can't see. So, but also where I can invite people from all over the world. So that was the initial concept. But then once the materials started to come into the space and I started to work with them, that sort of that demand didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to try and hit that demand because it was the concept. What made sense, because like one just simple, like the dirt sort of spills faster. I thought, like just the kind of accumulation. So the materials themselves then started to shift. And so I spoke with Derek about the initial concept, and we wanted it to be, I didn't think about the death and tarot card, but I love those kind of happy accidents. And of course, the number 13 is sort of always associated with death in some way. And it's still, while I didn't achieve the sort of spillage in every time zone, it still sort of allowed me to kind of spill over. So the spillover became minimal instead of excessive. And I don't know, I liked that. So thanks, Hannah, for that question.
So I'm curious how you trace time while you are in the performance, just in terms of your own awareness of where you are in the whole, in the whole journey. Like if you have that sense of, oh, I'm just at the beginning, or are you watching or experiencing time in some particular way that orients you to beginning, middle, and end?
That's a difficult question, right? Just, I probably need to process my experience of time a little bit in this piece, but I don't experience, I worry about how to begin. And if I ever think I know an ending, I'm always wrong. Which was seen last night in that I did give the permission. I don't use a clock on stage, and I don't have someone signal me or something. So while there's a certain time, there's a clock built into the sound, and there's a clock built into the rhythm of people's bodies, and there's a clock. That space is windowless, but I can kind of see when the building shifts, you know, there's different markers of time. And that's one thing I pay attention to. I pay attention to those markers of time. But I never know an end. It's like if I have an idea of an ending, it never goes that way. And last night I told the tech guys who were remotely just going to turn off the live stream that they could just turn it off at 1. And because they had talked about how I might end, I think they were so cautious to not preemptively turn it off. So I think I experience time as very layered, and I try to let go of the demand of time. I try and let the space have its own time. Like I try, and multiple times at once. I try and let those things come to the surface, and free myself from the worry of what kind of time has passed in a linear way. Because whenever I start to worry about that, it takes a lot of energy. And that sort of interests me relative to daily life, and like also our demand in daily life of like, what is it to be timely? And because I think I would get exhausted if I thought, oh, it's only hour 6 and I have 6 more hours or something. I think it would really, or when I have those moments, I guess I've trained myself to try and let them go so that I don't, because like your body, when it starts to go, it goes. And you think there's no way I can push another thing of dirt. And if you do that, and then simultaneously the consciousness enters, like I have 4 more hours, those things don't mix well. So I've tried to train myself to let it go, but we live in a society that trains us in an opposite way of that. So it takes practice. It takes a lot of work to try and let those things go. And I'm curious how other people experience time when they enter that space, particularly if they are trying to keep like an agenda, like at a university where like students are going to class or professors are going to class, or maybe you think you're going to come for 20 minutes. Did anyone stay for an hour? Or and there's also, I wanted to let Angela know that some of those people who entered the frame are here in the room, so they're welcome to, you guys are welcome to respond to some of the questions as well. And everyone is welcome to be on camera and talk. It's meant to be a discussion between all of us as well.
There is a series of questions in the chat right now, all directed to you, Raegan. So it seems to me it might be interesting, before we put you on the spot, which you really did want to do only at the end, that maybe if some more of the people who were there as audience might just talk about their experience of it and what they expected maybe versus what they finally experienced. We make assumptions when we come into work, which come in to see something, which often can be challenged, or you think differently having sat with it for a while. So perhaps some of you who were there, I didn't see you, but you might speak to your experience of watching it. And I think it's also worth noting how long you stayed, or whether you returned later, just to have a sense of your time with it. Don't all shout at once, come on.
I'll talk, I'll start. Hi everyone, I'm Erin Schoneveld. I'm participating in the reenactment seminar with Raegan, and so I've had the opportunity really spent since last September getting to know her and engage with her. And I also participated, sorry, my children are coming in the house now. I also participated in the event, or in the prompts for this event. So I was really excited to see it. I've never seen a durational performance. And I was also excited because of the prompt that Raegan provided and encouraging us to sort of break the line, break the wall, and come through. So I did. And there was a lot of, I think, energy in my first visit. I came for an hour. Really sorry, it's hectic here. But I came for an
Life
hour.
happens.
Really
It's
exciting.
okay.
Probably the first 15, 20 minutes. I was in the dirt. And then I came back later in the evening, a couple hours later, and I didn't sort of cross over, and it was much, I was more tired, but it was just more sort of contemplative. And I actually was hoping I would hear my letter. I was sad that I did not, but I was still really moved to see Raegan, to be there, to experience it, and to known that that to have been a part, or to have been engaged in the process. It was really exciting. So thank you, Raegan, and sorry for all the noise.
Well, one of the things we have learned with the pandemic is that people have lives and families and live in spaces with other bodies, and sound happens, and that's real. So we just have to, like, it's okay that the children can be heard. All right. Anyone else?
So I wasn't there in person. I also watched remotely, and my work schedule unfortunately only allowed me to watch in the morning and midday. So that was my experience. But one thing I would say too is having watched this remotely and others in person, the same thing happened, which is, that it's talking about Raegan letting go of time. Like, I have an acute sense of how time is going on. So later I was driving in the car and still thinking, while I'm doing all these other things, Raegan is still performing. So I think that's one thing that maybe others can weigh in on and discuss, how just having that shapes our perception of time, even if we're not watching or get to be in the space. And the other thing I wanted to kind of invite others maybe to comment on too, and what Aaron brought up is, like, whenever you're watching, if you've been participating, you hope that you're going to hear your own voice maybe, or you recognize the voice of others. And so with the idea of recitation, there's recognition because of how the piece was created, and either you recognize your own voice or those who who are also invited to join, but then there's the weird sense of recognition of people's voices who you don't know per se, and how that functions too, and how that maps right now to the pandemic in terms of people maybe we know who have died of COVID or those who have not, and this idea of recognition and the singular and the collective, and thinking too about Derek and the soundscape that you created and how you allowed for both kind of the obfuscation and recognition of voices and things throughout the performance and the piece. So just offering those observations and for others to kind of weigh into. And sorry, I'm at the archives, so I have to be masked, but it's very hard to mask on Zoom, so don't tell anybody.
I can talk a bit about what Lexi brought up in terms of, so I was there physically twice. I went once in the middle of the performance, I think, at around maybe 5, 6, and then one towards the end of it, so at around 11 p.m. It's funny to me that I'm like coming up with all of these really, distinct time markers, whereas for Raegan it was most likely like she didn't have any marker of those, right? So it was interesting, like to be there and then go, not only like temporarily but spatially as well, to be there and then go and do a bunch of stuff, like go to the other campus for a class and come back, and then like go to my house, my dorm, go to my work, and then just all these things in between. I've been and thinking again during this time, Raegan is in like one space and one potentially time. so the first time I went was quite intense. I went alone. There was someone else there, so I didn't know them, but I still felt like I didn't feel so much as like, you know, these people who who might be watching it online and feeling like you're the only person watching it. So there was a certain sharedness there, and then it was intense in ways that it was very present, right? But unlike any live stream can be, there was really a lot of eye contact that I made with Raegan that made me feel so many things, almost like the grief was, all of the grief in the room, and there was a lot of grief in the room, manifesting itself through me. And there was some letters being read in languages that I didn't understand. I guess one of them maybe was Italian, and I sat there and I wasn't sure how long the letters were going to be. I wasn't checking time. And it just went on for a really long time, and it transformed itself. It got really, really intimate and emotional. And to witness that sort of made me very emotional as well, even though I didn't understand a word. I just thought about like my grief and my displacement and my, I guess like there's an inevitable symbolism with all of the luggage as well. And then the second time I went was a little interesting because I was hoping to go and sort of like not care about time and stay there. Not just like check my watch, it was evening as well, so I didn't have any place to be. But then when I was going there, I ran across some acquaintances, so we decided to like go together. And once that happened, I was like immediately, so I'm like in their time now, so I can't like, and there's this sort of like courtesy as well, because if you go together, so you also have to leave together, and you go there and then you can't stay as long as you want to. You have these like weird interactions with them, like should we leave or stay, or you can't really talk while seeing it as well. So that made it interesting. But the second time I remember, and Marilyn was talking about, you know, the senses, and how a screen blocks all of these senses at once, is that I could, well, not only hear and see it, but I could smell the room, right? I think that was something that stood out to me, especially there was this like plastic bag that you were sort of opening, and I could smell the plastic, and it was such an intense smell that made me think of so many places and times. I couldn't even put my finger on it, but like that. And it's it's not a very organic object to be in that room either. So it was sort of, I couldn't understand where it was coming from, but all of that elevated instances probably wouldn't happen on a live stream. That's why I'm glad I got to actually experience it in person. Yeah, I said many things, but I guess I had some questions as well, but I'll have to rethink about them because I forgot, and maybe I'll bring them up later.
Furniture covered in plastic. It's in one of the letters.
So if I could add on, hi Raegan, it's good to see you. I actually experienced the performance just on my work computer, which is interesting that this was I was working and at the same time was watching you, and then I got distracted and I had to turn it off, and I didn't really experience it until the very evening after work was completed. And a lot of things did come through, even through the screen. There's certain, after witnessing a couple of your performances, I started to see a certain style, and there were certain moments that felt very like time was moving very slowly, and then there were certain moments when it felt like time was moving very, very fast. I felt the moments in which you were holding some luggage with just like one finger or one hand and slowly turning into one finger, felt like time was moving so slowly, and I kind of wanted that moment to like really last a long time until finally you let go and it swung, and then time started moving really, really fast, or it was just a lot more dynamic. Or when you started really moving that plastic covering violently, and just all I felt was rage. things were just moving so fast, and then it kind of stopped. And then, so even within the performance, there were a lot of moments in which I was so captivated that it felt like it was moving so slowly, and then something happened, and then I kind of jumped out of it, and I realized, oh, whoa, something just happened, some kind of energy just moved, and then you can see either the flapping of the plastic or the movement of the luggage. And I was reminded of some of your other performance in Citation with the rocking chair moving back and forth. And so it was really lovely to witness that and to kind of remember also specifically that rocking chair in Citations when you performed it in San Francisco. So yeah, that's kind of what I experienced, and it's really, really nice to see you. And I hope you're feeling well today after that performance.
I was also really I felt like I entered into the performance kind of zone, the gallery space. I found myself a few times like kind of being in sync with the swaying of luggage and suitcases, and almost in a like a sort of self-soothing kind of way, that rocking gesture. I felt really and I just found myself doing it. It was kind of an interesting just sort of reflection that I had. But then that also brings me to the question of how and where the work exists, and what the white box gallery space provides in terms of durational work, and knowing that you have done so much work outside of the gallery space as well, out in other kinds of landscapes. And it kind of sort of crystallized in my mind. There was a particular gesture that I think maybe, I don't know, somewhere around halfway through, maybe 6-7 hours, where you were sort of laying on your side and you were very still for a long time, kind of you had been moving dirt around. And it reminded me of someone that I had seen just the week before, someone who was, most likely homeless out on the street, not far from my house, of just this gesture of complete surrender, right? And so I was thinking about that context of, body language in one environment, right? And then what happens when we remove it from that space and we insert it into another space? And so how is it read? How is it legible? What is then the responsibility that we have as folks entering into the gallery space, or witnessing this act of witnessing that I think is so incredibly important when it comes to grief. And it's one that I think is a skill to be learned, right? Like we don't automatically know how to witness each other in spaces and in experiences of grief, right? And so there's something about the work and what you're doing that I think opens up those questions and asks people to acknowledge their position, as a witness, as a participant. You are inviting us into that kind of space. Yeah.
I think, am I correct? We have 10 more minutes. Is that true? We better get to some questions for Raegan. Am I right or wrong about that?
Can I ask a question? I think I was the person who entered the space first. I was the person who in a way, broke into the space with my foot in the dirt. That was me. And I mean, I have many questions and, many things I want to discuss with Raegan. But my first question will be, I mean, did I violate this space in some way? And was Raegan surprised? And what she was thinking at the time when she saw, me somehow, breaking into that space recklessly and being so, really, reckless in my entry into the space, and what she thinks both as a performer at the moment and also as the character in the performance, because I suppose there is a difference between these two facets.
Did I answer that now?
Yeah, I think so.
I know that I saw Eric wanted to say something earlier too, so I want to make sure that we cycle back to that.
Do you want to answer that question real quick first, and then I can say something?
You didn't violate the space. The space is there for you and for us. And I actually don't. We'll have to talk about the character performer, because it's not a character. It's not a character, but I am performing, and it's, I don't have the I don't know. I'm in my most high performance level, I guess, because I'm being watched, and I know that witnessing, like Angela said, is like I tell my students, make something that is, if you're going to ask people to witness something, make sure you're conscious that you're asking for that witnessing, and make something that is conscious of that ask. So no, you didn't violate the space, and I'm working with the energy that you bring into the space. So my sense was that you were questioning what you could and couldn't do. I mean, you were very first in, so you're the first body to come and warm the space up, and you stayed sort of on the periphery. The door to the gallery was half open at first, so people had to sort of come around it, and then it got pushed open. So the fact that the door was half open was really, I would say that was a nice surprise for me, because a lot of people wouldn't cross that boundary. And that took courage, to come into the space. And then my experience was just that you were questioning. So I was sort of with you in your questioning, and I was sort of with you in your discovery of the space, because I was, installing those objects and things for a long time. So it was sort of nice to have a curious body come in. Yeah, and I'll turn it over to Derek, but of course we can talk.
Hi everyone. I wanted to just quickly, or just sort of address this thing that was interesting to me from the people who, from Aaron and Lexi, who participated in writing a letter, and then also to reading it out loud and recording it, and graciously, providing that kind of material in our research for the piece. And it's interesting to me to hear both Lexi and Aaron say that they had wished that they had heard their voice and their letter being read in the piece, which of course was something that I struggled with and thought a lot about when making the work. And I think that my experience with receiving all of this material, which was there was quite a lot of it, and it was of course extremely personal, or for the most part, personal, and moving, and quite difficult, really, to I had to stop. I couldn't just take 3 hours and go through and listen to all this material, because it was just, some of it was quite devastating. Some of it was, sort of banal, and just totally boring. And, it just kind of ran the gamut of just like all these experiences. And so I had to sort of take it in pieces. But I think ultimately what my experience with that material was that and in thinking about how to use it as material in making a piece of work, I ultimately found a lot of it so personal that it became, in Raegan and I talking about it, I used the word opaque, where it was so personal that there was no real way for me to access it. because it was between, you know, these were letters written from one person to another. And so in thinking about how to do sort of private mourning, private grief, and public mourning, public grief, I was really faced, I think, with a kind of reality that there is a kind of very private grief that is ultimately inaccessible to other people, and that to do public mourning, there has to be something, you know, there has to be something else. There has to be this other thing that we do together, maybe that we share, that does public mourning, and that the private version of that like ultimately has to remain inaccessible, I think. Or that was my experience with this material, was that I couldn't find a way to instrumentalize that. It felt wrong in a lot of cases. Anyway, so my apologies to Erin and Lexi and anyone else who wanted to hear their voice. It was.
I was thinking, I have to say, Derek and I didn't talk about that. I think this is important too for students. We argued about this sometimes, in as much as he and I argue, because I felt a need for this sort of the inarticulable just be present, and Derek felt for the as sort of he's expressing that there was a private public thing, and that became sort of I think something he realized, or that he and I are thinking about. And this morning I was thinking that as a series of possible performances, we still have that material, you know, so I don't need to make Recitation again. That piece was made, but there may be another piece that uses, you know, some of that material in a different way or something. And then, and I should also say, because I know the material very well, I've listened to, for those who don't know, there's 3 prompts. So every person, they're probably sent about 2.5 hours of material. That would be the longest. So I have that sort of in my body. I know the material. And so then for me, the sound, which I had never heard before the performance, the final score, had such a vacuous void of those voices. It made the performance really challenging for me, which is why it's wonderful to work with the collaborator as well as, you know, even if, you know, I felt like the sound piece was really it really had Derek's stamp on it in a way that that I'm very honored to have performed, you know, in.
Friends, we're coming up to 5 o'clock. This is Ken Colton-Fromm again from the Herford Center. If anyone has any last comment or thought,
or we could make Raegan talk. One more last question for her.
I wanted to just add one thing. Vicky is sort of addressing it in a question in the chat about this notion of permission. And as she writes, the first thing I experienced was relief that you were giving me permission to not answer emails for a while. Then I was just happy to unfold my brain a bit and allow myself to be mesmerized. And so to think about what that means to give permission to let go, basically, to make that shift from workspace and all of the obligations, and to create an opportunity for people to enter into a space of grief, right? And that as a way to undermine the privatization of grieving and the privatization of mourning, I think is incredibly important, right? And that it's that thing, like if you see someone crying, it's often there's an empathic response in the body that, you might also tear up a little bit or have, right, there's things that are happening on an empathic level that, but it takes that person kind of standing in that space of, I'm grieving. This is a space of grief, right? That's the catalyst. And so I think that's really what the opportunity is here, and what you have created in Recitation is saying, like, look, this is that space is right here and in the gallery, and inviting people to come and to be in that space. So gratitude.
Thank you. I think that's, I can't add anything more. Thank you, Angela. That really is an appropriate place to end.
Indeed. Thank you, Angela. Thank you, Marilyn. Thanks, Derek. And of course, Raegan, for that incredible performance. And thank everyone for participating and reacting. This has been really a powerful conclusion in a way, but opening it to, as Angela said, to a space of engagement. So thank you all. I also want to particularly thank Justin Geller for enabling this Zoom conversation as he does behind the background. Thank you, Justin. And of course, James Weisinger and Matthew Callanan, who have enabled this event and so many events for the Herbert Center to be so productive and so wonderful. So thank to James and Matthew, to Justin, to all of you. Have a great weekend and be safe.